I found the text messages on a Tuesday morning in late August, my husband's phone lighting up with notifications while he showered before an early meeting. The preview on the lock screen was enough. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again, T." My stomach dropped even as I told myself there could be innocent explanations. But 15 years of marriage gives you instincts. And mine were screaming that this wasn't innocent. I picked up his phone and used the passcode I'd always known, our wedding anniversary, ironically, and opened the conversation with someone named Tessa. The messages went back 3 months, filled with explicit exchanges, declarations of how alive she made him feel, discussions of when they could meet next. "You make me feel young again," my husband Garrett had written 2 weeks ago. "Being with you reminds me of who I was before life got so complicated." Life getting complicated apparently meant our 15-year marriage, our 2 children, and the partnership I'd thought we'd built while I'd supported his career advancement from junior analyst to managing director. The shower turned off, and I quickly returned Garrett's phone to the nightstand, my mind racing. I could confront him now, immediately, demand explanations and apologies. Or I could do something smarter, gather information, understand the full picture, and make decisions from a position of strength rather than emotional reaction. I chose the latter. Over the next week, I became a detective in my own marriage, documenting Garrett's affair with methodical precision. I installed monitoring software on our shared computer that captured his emails and messages. I checked credit card statements, finding charges for hotels, expensive dinners, gifts I'd never received. I hired a private investigator, a woman named Caroline who specialized in infidelity cases, and promised discretion. What Caroline uncovered was both predictable and devastating. Tessa Martinelli was 28 years old, 12 years younger than me, 15 years younger than Garrett. She worked as a junior analyst at his firm, reporting to a different division but crossing paths with Garrett frequently at company events and meetings. They'd started their affair 3 months ago at an out-of-town conference, the classic cliché of hotel bars and lowered inhibitions leading to betrayal. "Your husband is already talking to her about leaving you," Caroline told me during our second meeting, showing me photographs of Garrett and Tessa having lunch, walking hand in hand through a park, kissing outside her apartment. "I've seen this pattern before. He's in the infatuation stage, convinced this younger woman represents a fresh start, a return to his youth. He'll probably announce he wants a divorce soon." She was right. 2 weeks after I'd found the initial text messages, Garrett asked me to dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown. He was nervous throughout the meal, making stilted conversation and drinking wine faster than usual. Finally, over dessert he barely touched, Garrett delivered the speech he'd apparently rehearsed. "Piper, we need to talk about our marriage," he began, using the serious tone he employed at work presentations. "We've grown apart over the years. We're different people than we were when we got married. I think we've both known for a while that this isn't working anymore." I said nothing, letting him continue with his prepared justifications. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about what I want from life, and I don't think we want the same things anymore. I think we'd both be happier if we acknowledged that and moved forward separately." Still, I stayed silent, watching him struggle with my lack of reaction. "I want a divorce," Garrett finally said bluntly. "I think it's the right thing for both of us. We can handle this civilly, use mediators, make it as painless as possible for everyone." "Is there someone else?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. Garrett had the grace to look uncomfortable. "That's not really relevant. The marriage was already failing before." "Before you started sleeping with Tessa Martinelli from your office?" I interrupted calmly. "The 28-year-old junior analyst you've been having an affair with for 3 months?" Garrett's face went white, then red. "How did you?" "I'm not an idiot, Garrett. You've been sloppy. Text messages, credit card charges, obvious patterns. Did you really think I wouldn't notice or wouldn't investigate?" He recovered quickly, shifting to defensiveness. "So you've been spying on me. That's a violation of privacy, Piper." "And conducting an affair while married is a violation of marriage vows," I replied. "But let's not get distracted by competing grievances. You want a divorce, fine. We'll divorce. But it won't be the quick, painless process you're imagining." Garrett's jaw tightened. I'm not trying to make this difficult. I'm willing to be fair about asset division. Fair, I repeated. Garrett, I've spent 15 years supporting your career. I deferred my master's degree so you could pursue your MBA. I turned down job opportunities that would have required relocating when your firm offered you promotions here. I've managed our household, raised our children, and accommodated your 80-hour work weeks while keeping my own career secondary. I leaned forward. Fair would be recognizing those contributions. Fair would be acknowledging that your career success happened because I sacrificed my own advancement. Fair would be a settlement that reflects reality, rather than your desire to start fresh with minimal financial burden. Garrett's expression hardened. If you're planning to make this a fight, I'll hire the best divorce attorney money can buy. You won't walk away with some massive settlement just because you're angry I moved on. Moved on? I laughed bitterly. You didn't move on, Garrett. You traded in your 40-year-old wife for a 28-year-old model who makes you feel young and vital. That's not moving on, that's a midlife crisis cliché. I stood up, ready to leave this expensive restaurant and the man I'd built my adult life around. Hire whatever attorney you want. I've already retained Patricia Novak, and she specializes in cases exactly like ours. Successful men who undervalue their wives' contributions and try to minimize support obligations. The name Patricia Novak clearly registered. Garrett had been on the losing end of one of her cases 2 years ago, watching a colleague get eviscerated in divorce proceedings that awarded the wife 60% of marital assets plus substantial ongoing support. You're being vindictive, Garrett said. I'm being strategic, I corrected. There's a difference. And you're about to learn that trading me in for someone younger was the most expensive mistake of your life. I left him sitting at the table with the check, walking out of that restaurant with my head high and my resolve crystallizing into cold determination. Garrett wanted to start fresh with Tessa. Fine, but he'd pay appropriately for that fresh start, and I'd make sure my own fresh start was built on solid financial ground. Over the next 2 months, Patricia and I built an airtight case. We documented every financial contribution I'd made to Garrett's career advancement, the MBA tuition I'd helped pay, the professional wardrobe I'd purchased, the networking events I'd hosted at our home. We calculated the opportunity cost of my career sacrifices, the promotions I'd turned down, the advanced degree I'd deferred, the salary growth I'd missed by keeping my work flexible to accommodate his demanding schedule. We quantified my domestic labor, the childcare, household management, social coordination, and support services that had freed Garrett to focus entirely on career advancement. Patricia also uncovered financial misconduct that strengthened our case considerably. Your husband has been moving money, she told me during one meeting, showing me documentation of accounts I'd never known existed. He opened several accounts in his name only over the past 18 months, transferring funds from your joint accounts gradually enough that you might not notice month to month. He's been planning this, I realized. Planning to leave, planning to minimize what I could claim in a divorce. Probably, Patricia agreed, though his planning was sloppy. We can trace all of it, prove dissipation of marital assets, and use it to argue for a more favorable settlement. Courts don't like spouses who hide money while planning divorce. We also documented the affair thoroughly, with Caroline's surveillance photographs showing Garrett and Tessa together at hotels, restaurants, and her apartment during times he'd claimed to be working late or traveling for business. The affair itself isn't grounds for a different settlement in this state, since we have no-fault divorce, Patricia explained. But it establishes a pattern of dishonesty and can influence a judge's view of his credibility when we're arguing about finances. The divorce proceedings officially began in October. Garrett's attorney, an aggressive litigator named Franklin Hayes, immediately tried to position the divorce as mutual and amicable, suggesting we split assets 50-50 and minimize support obligations. Patricia demolished that narrative by presenting evidence of Garrett's hidden accounts, his affair, and his systematic planning to divorce me while protecting his financial interests. Your client has been conducting an affair while transferring marital funds into accounts his wife had no knowledge of. Patricia told Franklin during our first mediation session. This isn't an amicable mutual decision to separate. This is a man who planned to leave his wife while systematically hiding money and conducting a relationship with a woman 15 years younger. Franklin tried to argue that my career contributions were irrelevant since I'd maintained employment throughout our marriage. Patricia countered with documentation showing I'd kept my income deliberately modest by choosing flexible positions that allowed me to manage our household while Garrett worked excessive hours. Mrs. Hayes maintained employment while also serving as primary parent, household manager, and support system for her husband's career, Patricia argued. She made strategic sacrifices that enabled his advancement. That needs to be recognized in asset division. The mediation session ended without resolution, both sides too far apart on settlement terms. We'd have to go to court, which Franklin had warned would be expensive and time-consuming. I didn't care. This wasn't just about money, it was about accountability, about Garrett facing real consequences for his choices rather than getting to start fresh with minimal disruption. Meanwhile, my personal life was evolving in unexpected directions. I'd gone back to school, enrolling in the master's program in healthcare administration. I'd deferred 15 years ago. The classes were challenging, requiring intense focus and study that left little time for dwelling on my failing marriage. But they were also exhilarating, using my mind in ways I'd forgotten were possible. Reconnecting with the ambitious professional I'd been before marriage and motherhood had redirected my energy. I'd also started therapy with a counselor named Dr. Helena Marshall, processing the betrayal and rebuilding my sense of self after years of defining myself primarily through my role as Garrett's wife. "You're not a victim," Dr. Marshall told me during one session. "You're someone whose partner made selfish choices, but those choices don't define you or limit what you can become next." She was right. The betrayal hurt, but it was also clarifying. I'd spent 15 years subordinating my ambitions to support Garrett's, and while I didn't regret the choices I'd made for our family, I recognized I'd lost parts of myself in the process. The divorce was giving me an opportunity to reclaim those parts, to rebuild on my own terms. I also reconnected with friends I'd neglected during the intensive years of managing Garrett's career and raising young children. Natalie, my former colleague from my first professional job, became my closest confidant, listening to my struggles and offering perspective from someone who'd been through her own difficult divorce. "The hardest part isn't the betrayal," Natalie told me over coffee one afternoon. "It's rebuilding your identity as a single person after years of being part of a couple. But it's also liberating once you push through that initial grief and uncertainty." "I'm not sure I'm grieving the marriage," I admitted. "I'm more angry than sad. Angry at being undervalued, at having my contributions dismissed, at being traded in like I'm obsolete." "Then use that anger," Natalie advised. "Channel it into building something extraordinary. The best revenge isn't making him regret leaving you. It's becoming so successful and fulfilled that his opinion becomes irrelevant." The court proceedings began in December. I testified about our marriage, about the sacrifices I'd made, about Garrett's affair and hidden accounts. Garrett testified that I'd exaggerated my contributions, that he'd achieved success primarily through his own effort, that my career sacrifices were choices I'd made voluntarily, that he shouldn't be penalized for. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Harriet Brennan, listened to both sides with careful attention. I could tell she was unimpressed by Garrett's attempts to minimize my contributions, particularly when confronted with evidence of his hidden accounts and affair. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Brennan said during cross-examination, "you testified that your wife's decision to maintain flexible employment was voluntary and shouldn't factor into asset division. But the evidence shows you directly benefited from that flexibility. She managed your household, raised your children, hosted networking events that advanced your career. How is that not a contribution to your professional success?" Garrett fumbled through an answer about how lots of people manage dual careers and children without one spouse sacrificing advancement. That my choices were about what I wanted, rather than what he needed. Judge Brennan wasn't buying it. "So when you worked 80-hour weeks and traveled extensively for business, who was managing your household and children during that time?" Well, Piper was, but... And when you hosted colleagues at your home for networking dinners that helped establish professional relationships, who planned and executed those events? Piper did, but that was just... And when you pursued your MBA, a degree that directly contributed to your career advancement, who helped pay the tuition and managed your household while you studied? Garrett had gone, red-faced, realizing Judge Brennan was systematically dismantling his argument that my contributions were minimal. The proceedings continued for 3 days, with expert testimony about marital asset division, evidence of Garrett's financial misconduct, and documentation of my career sacrifices. Patricia was relentless, presenting every detail we'd compiled to paint a clear picture of a wife who'd enabled her husband's success, while he'd planned betrayal and financial manipulation. By the 3rd day, Franklin Hayes was suggesting settlement discussions, clearly recognizing that continued litigation was unlikely to improve Garrett's outcome. We met in mediation again, this time with very different dynamics. Patricia laid out our settlement proposal: 65% of marital assets to me, including the house, spousal support of $8,000 monthly for 10 years, and Garrett covering all my legal fees plus reimbursement for affair-related expenses he'd charged to joint credit cards. "This is excessive," Franklin protested. "You're punishing my client for the affair and asking for more than standard asset division. Your client conducted an affair while systematically hiding money and planning to divorce his wife while minimizing her claims," Patricia countered. "The settlement reflects appropriate accountability for that behavior, plus recognition of my client's substantial contributions to his career success." Garrett looked furious, but defeated. After a brief consultation with Franklin, he agreed to the settlement terms rather than risk a judge potentially awarding me even more. The divorce was finalized in February, 7 months after Garrett had first asked for it over that dinner. I walked out of the courthouse owning our house outright, holding 65% of our marital assets worth approximately $2.3 million, and guaranteed 10 years of support that would give me financial security while I rebuilt my career and completed my degree. Garrett, meanwhile, was left with roughly $1.2 million in assets, the obligation to pay substantial monthly support, and significantly reduced earning power since I'd structured the settlement to take a percentage of his partnership interest at the firm. The arrangement meant his compensation would be reduced by approximately 20% for the next decade as I received my share of partnership distributions. He'd wanted a fresh start with Tessa. He got one, just much more expensive than he'd planned. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I completed my master's degree in healthcare administration with a 3.9 GPA. I'd thrown myself into the program with an intensity I hadn't felt in years, rediscovering the intellectual capability and professional ambition I'd set aside during my marriage. The sense of accomplishment walking across that stage to receive my diploma was profound, not just for the degree itself, but for what it represented about reclaiming my identity and capabilities. I immediately began applying for healthcare administration positions, targeting roles at hospitals and medical centers, looking for someone with my combination of education, experience, and strategic thinking. Within 2 months, I accepted a position as director of operations at a major hospital system, with a starting salary of $120,000 plus benefits. It was more than I'd ever earned before. Triple what I'd been making in the flexible administrative position I'd kept during my marriage. The work was challenging and demanding, requiring the kind of focused dedication that wouldn't have been possible while managing Garrett's household and career needs. But now I could dedicate myself fully, and the results were remarkable. I thrived in the role, implementing efficiency improvements that saved the hospital system millions while improving patient care outcomes. My supervisors noticed, and within a year, I was promoted to Vice President of Operations with a salary increase to $160,000. I was building a career that was genuinely mine, based on my capabilities rather than shaped by someone else's needs. Meanwhile, Garrett's life was apparently not going as smoothly. I heard through mutual acquaintances that his relationship with Tessa had deteriorated significantly once the excitement of the affair faded and they faced the reality of building an actual partnership. Turns out a 28-year-old has different life priorities than a 43-year-old with 2 children from a previous marriage, Natalie reported after running into someone from Garrett's firm. Tessa wanted to travel and focus on her career, while Garrett wanted someone to replace the domestic support system he'd had with you. They fought constantly. They'd broken up 6 months after my divorce was finalized, with Tessa apparently frustrated by Garrett's expectation that she'd manage his household and accommodate his children's schedules, while also maintaining her own career. She told him she wasn't interested in being his housekeeper and stepmother. Natalie continued that she'd thought he wanted a partner, not a replacement wife to recreate what he'd had before. They ended badly, with Garrett apparently shocked that she wouldn't subordinate her life to his needs. The irony was rich. Garrett had traded me in for someone younger, expecting to recapture his youth while still maintaining all the domestic and emotional support I'd provided. Instead, he'd learned that younger women had their own ambitions and weren't interested in the traditional support role he'd taken for granted during our marriage. I felt no satisfaction in his failed relationship. That would require caring about his life, and I'd moved well beyond that. But I appreciated the cosmic justice of him learning that the grass wasn't actually greener, just differently complicated. 2 years after the divorce, I bought a new house. Not the family home we'd shared, which I'd sold for a significant profit, but a smaller, more modern townhouse in a walkable neighborhood near my office. The space was entirely mine, decorated to my taste, sized for my actual needs rather than some aspirational vision of what successful people should own. I furnished it with pieces I loved, hung artwork that spoke to me, created a home office that reflected my professional identity. It was the first space I'd ever inhabited that was completely, unambiguously mine. No compromises, no accommodations, no consideration of anyone else's preferences or needs. I also started dating again, cautiously and selectively. The first few attempts were awkward. I'd been out of the dating market for nearly 2 decades, and the landscape had changed dramatically with apps and new social protocols. But gradually I found my footing, meeting interesting people, and learning what I actually wanted in a partner, rather than simply accepting whatever relationship presented itself. One relationship became serious. A man named Thomas, a physician at my hospital who was divorced himself and understood the complexities of rebuilding after a marriage ended. We dated for 8 months, developing genuine connection and compatibility. But ultimately, we wanted different things from life, and we ended the relationship amicably, remaining friends and colleagues. "I think you're still figuring out who you are post-divorce," Thomas told me when we had the breakup conversation. "That's healthy and necessary, but it means you're not really available for the kind of partnership I'm looking for. You need more time being independently yourself." He was right, and I appreciated his honesty. I wasn't ready for serious partnership yet, because I was still enjoying the novelty of prioritizing my own needs, making decisions unilaterally, discovering preferences I'd never examined during years of compromise and accommodation. 3 years after the divorce, I was promoted again, this time to Chief Operating Officer of my hospital system. At 43, I was one of the youngest people to achieve that position in the organization's history, recognized for my strategic vision and operational excellence. My salary increased to $220,000, and I received equity in the hospital system's parent company that made my total compensation package worth approximately $300,000 annually. I'd achieved professional success that exceeded anything I'd imagined during my marriage, built on my own capabilities rather than through someone else's accomplishments. I'd also completed additional certifications in healthcare leadership and started speaking at industry conferences about operational excellence and change management. My expertise was recognized nationally, and I was invited to serve on advisory boards and contribute to professional publications. The woman Garrett had traded in for someone younger had become more successful than he'd ever been, building a career and reputation that stood entirely on its own merit. I heard through the grapevine that Garrett had remarried, a woman closer to his own age, who worked in finance and apparently had no interest in managing his domestic life. They'd hired a nanny for his children and a housekeeper for their home, outsourcing all the support labor I'd provided for free during our marriage. He finally figured out that someone has to do that work, Natalie commented when she heard the news. And that paying for it is expensive. Probably makes him appreciate what you contributed, though I doubt he'd ever admit it. I didn't care whether Garrett appreciated my past contributions. His recognition or regret was irrelevant to my current life, which was thriving independent of anything related to him. 4 years after the divorce, my children, now teenagers, started asking questions about the marriage and its end. They'd been young enough during the divorce that they'd accepted the basic explanation of parents growing apart, but as they matured, they wanted more context. "Did Dad leave you for that woman, Tessa?" My daughter Sophia asked during a particularly candid conversation. "Because I remember her coming to school events that year, and then she disappeared after you and Dad split up." I considered how much truth to share with a 16-year-old. "Your father made choices that ended our marriage," I said carefully, including developing a relationship with someone else before being honest with me about wanting a divorce. But the marriage was already struggling, and the affair was a symptom of larger problems. "He traded you for someone younger," Sophia said bluntly. "That's what my friend's mom said, that Dad had a midlife crisis and left you for a younger woman." "That's one way to characterize it," I agreed. "Though I think it's more complicated than that. Your father was looking for something he thought he'd lost: youth, excitement, validation. He thought a younger woman would provide that. It didn't work out the way he expected." "Are you glad?" my son Elliot asked, 14 and perceptive. "That you got divorced?" It was a surprisingly complicated question. "I'm sad that our family changed and that you two had to experience the disruption of divorce," I replied honestly. "But I'm not sad about the direction my life has gone since then. I've built a career I'm proud of, discovered capabilities I'd forgotten I had, and become someone I genuinely like, rather than just someone defined by my role in someone else's life." "You seem happier," Sophia observed. "More confident or something. Like you take up more space than you used to." It was a perceptive observation from a teenager. I had been taking up more space, advocating for myself in meetings, pursuing opportunities rather than waiting for permission, making decisions based on what I wanted rather than what seemed least disruptive to others. Divorce was hard, I told both of them. But it also freed me to become someone I might not have become otherwise. That doesn't make it good or bad, it just is. And I've chosen to use it as an opportunity rather than just a tragedy. 5 years after the divorce, I received an unexpected call from Garrett. We'd maintained minimal contact beyond coordinating children's schedules and school events, our communication limited to logistics and conducted primarily through text. "I wanted to talk to you about something," Garrett said, sounding uncharacteristically tentative. "Can we meet for coffee?" "Curious," I agreed. We met at a neutral cafe, sitting across from each other for the first time in years. Garrett looked older than I remembered, the stress of the past 5 years evident in gray hair and lines around his eyes. "I wanted to apologize," Garrett began without preamble, "for how I handled things, for the affair, for trying to hide money, for undervaluing your contributions to my success and our family. I was selfish and arrogant, and you deserved better." I studied him, trying to determine if this apology was genuine or motivated by some other agenda. "What prompted this?" I asked. Garrett ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from years of marriage. "Therapy, mostly. And my second divorce, which forced me to confront patterns in how I approach relationships and partnership. My therapist helped me recognize that what happened with you wasn't just about falling out of love or finding someone more compatible. It was about my refusal to value the work you were doing that enabled my success." He continued, "When I married you, I took for granted that you'd manage our household, raise our children, and accommodate my career needs. I never really examined what you were sacrificing to make that possible, or whether that arrangement was fair. And when you started wanting recognition for those contributions, I felt threatened rather than grateful." "So you left for someone who seemed less demanding," I said. Garrett nodded. I thought Tessa would be easier, less complicated, that a younger woman would be more impressed by my success and less focused on fairness or reciprocity. But that's not how people work, and that relationship fell apart quickly when she realized I expected her to subordinate her needs to mine. And now you're in another divorce facing similar issues? I asked. Garrett looked uncomfortable. My second wife, Catherine, is a successful professional who had no interest in managing my domestic life. We fought constantly about division of household labor, childcare responsibilities, whose career took priority. Sound familiar? Extremely, I replied with dark humor. Maybe the problem isn't the women you choose, but the expectations you bring to marriage. That's exactly what my therapist said, Garrett admitted, that I need to examine what I think partnership means and whether I'm actually prepared to treat a spouse as an equal rather than as support staff for my career and life. It was satisfying to hear Garrett acknowledge what I'd tried to communicate during years of marriage, though I felt no particular triumph. His recognition didn't change the past or validate my previous attempts to address these dynamics. I appreciate the apology, I said honestly, and I hope therapy helps you build healthier relationships going forward. But Garrett, this apology is 5 years too late to change anything between us. I've moved on completely from our marriage and from caring about your recognition or regret. Garrett nodded. I know, I'm not asking for forgiveness or for us to be friends. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what you were saying during our marriage, and that I recognize how unfair I was. We parted amicably, and I watched him walk away feeling nothing, really. No lingering resentment, no satisfaction in his struggles, no interest in whether he ever figured out how to be a better partner. His life had become entirely separate from mine, and his recognition of past wrongs, while nice, was irrelevant to the life I'd built. 6 years after the divorce, I met someone who fundamentally changed my understanding of partnership. His name was Alexander, and he was a nonprofit executive director working in community health initiatives. We met at a healthcare conference, where we were both speaking on panels, struck up a conversation over drinks, and discovered remarkable compatibility in values, interests, and life philosophies. Alexander was 50, divorced with grown children, and had spent years examining his own patterns and learning from past relationship mistakes. Our relationship developed slowly, both of us cautious about repeating failures and determined to build something healthier. I don't want a traditional marriage, Alexander told me early in our relationship. I want an actual partnership, where both people's careers matter equally, where household responsibilities are genuinely shared, where neither person is subordinating their life to the other's agenda. That's exactly what I want, I replied, and what I never had in my first marriage. We dated for 2 years before moving in together, building a relationship based on mutual respect, shared responsibility, and genuine appreciation for each other's independence and capabilities. Alexander celebrated my career success rather than feeling threatened by it. He managed his own domestic responsibilities rather than expecting me to handle them. He made space for my ambitions while pursuing his own. It was the partnership I'd wanted during my marriage to Garrett but had never achieved. Because Garrett couldn't see past traditional gendered expectations of what wives should do. 7 years after my divorce, I was promoted to president and CEO of my hospital system. At 47, I was running a major healthcare organization, overseeing thousands of employees, managing a billion-dollar budget, and making strategic decisions that affected patient care across multiple facilities. My compensation package was worth approximately $450,000 annually, and I'd been featured in healthcare industry publications as an example of innovative leadership. The career I'd built post-divorce had exceeded any success I'd imagined during my marriage, built entirely on my own capabilities and determination, rather than as the supportive wife of someone else's achievements. I'd also become financially independent in ways that had nothing to do with Garrett's support payments, which had ended after 10 years as stipulated in our divorce settlement. My own earnings and investments had created security that was genuinely mine, earned through my work, rather than claimed through asset division. 8 years after the divorce, Alexander proposed. We married in a small ceremony attended by close friends and family. Our adult children from previous marriages standing with us as witnesses to a partnership built on very different foundations than our first marriages had been. To second chances, Alexander toasted during our reception, and to learning from our mistakes to build something better. The sentiment resonated with everyone present, most of whom had been through their own relationship challenges and rebuilding processes. My marriage to Alexander was built on lessons learned from my marriage to Garrett. About the importance of reciprocity, about valuing domestic and emotional labor, about maintaining individual identity within partnership. 9 years after Garrett had traded me for someone younger, I stood on a stage at a national healthcare conference, giving a keynote address about transformational leadership and organizational change. The audience was substantial, over 1,000 healthcare executives and administrators, and my presentation was being live-streamed to thousands more watching remotely. I talked about my journey from mid-level administrator to CEO, about the challenges I'd faced and the strategies I'd employed to overcome them. But I also talked about personal transformation, about the divorce that had forced me to rebuild my identity and discover capabilities I'd suppressed during years of subordinating my ambitions. 10 years ago, I was primarily defined by my role as someone's wife, I told the audience. I'd built my life around supporting my husband's career, managing our household, and making myself smaller so he could be bigger. And when that marriage ended, when he chose to leave for someone younger, I was devastated. I paused, letting that vulnerability sit before continuing. But that devastation became the catalyst for the most transformative period of my life. Forced to rebuild, I rediscovered ambitions I'd set aside, pursued education I'd deferred, and built a career that reflected my actual capabilities rather than my accommodated role. My ex-husband traded me for someone younger, thinking he was upgrading to a better model, I said. Instead, I upgraded my entire life. I went back to school, built a career based on my own merit, and became someone I'm genuinely proud to be rather than just proud to be associated with. The response was a standing ovation. After the presentation, dozens of women approached to share their own stories, marriages where they'd subordinated their careers, divorces that had forced rebuilding, transformations that had emerged from devastation. "Thank you for being honest about the divorce," one woman told me, tears in her eyes. "My husband just left me for his younger assistant, and I've been feeling like a failure. But hearing you talk about using it as a catalyst for growth rather than just as a tragedy, that helped me see possibilities rather than just loss." I gave her my card and connected her with resources I'd found helpful during my own rebuilding process. This was why sharing my story mattered, not to shame Garrett or celebrate his failures, but to show other women that divorce could be a beginning rather than just an ending. 10 years after the divorce, I received a letter from Garrett. Not a text or email, but an actual handwritten letter delivered to my office. I almost didn't open it, having no particular interest in whatever Garrett wanted to communicate after a decade of separate lives. But curiosity won out. "Piper," the letter began. "I know we haven't spoken in years beyond coordinating with the kids, and I don't expect you to respond to this letter. I'm writing primarily for myself, to acknowledge things I should have said years ago, but wasn't capable of articulating." The letter continued. "I saw your keynote address at the healthcare conference last month. A colleague shared the live stream and I watched the whole thing. You were extraordinary, confident, articulate, commanding that stage in ways I never saw during our marriage. And I realized watching you that I'd never actually known you at all. During our marriage, I saw you as a support system rather than a complete person. I valued what you did for me, managing our household, raising our children, accommodating my career, without ever really seeing you as someone with your own capabilities and ambitions. That was profoundly unfair to you. Leaving you for Tessa was the biggest mistake of my life, not because my subsequent relationships failed. That was inevitable, given I kept bringing the same broken expectations to new partnerships, but because I threw away something valuable before I was capable of appreciating it. You've built an extraordinary life and career in the decade since our divorce. You've become exactly who you were always capable of being, and I'm genuinely happy for your success. I'm also genuinely sorry that my inability to value you as a complete person meant you had to rebuild independently, rather than having a partner who supported your growth during our marriage." The letter concluded, "I don't expect forgiveness or reconciliation. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what I lost when I traded you for someone younger. You didn't just upgrade your life after our divorce, you became the person you'd always had the potential to be. And that person is remarkable. With respect and regret, Garrett." I read the letter twice, feeling satisfied, perhaps, but not vindicated. Garrett's recognition of what he'd lost came too late to change anything, but it completed a circle that had been open since our divorce. He'd traded me for someone younger, thinking he was upgrading. Instead, I'd upgraded everything. My career, my sense of self, my understanding of partnership, my life on every measurable level. And while Garrett had spent a decade learning painful lessons about his own limitations and failed expectations, I'd spent that same decade building something extraordinary from the ashes of our failed marriage. I filed his letter away and returned to work.